the front? Yep, okay, great. We will make a start because I guess people may join in online or come through the door there in the club. Welcome. But there's quite a lot to fit in, and we've sort of given an hour for this. And then for those at the club, there'll be a wee session afterwards to try and put some of this sort of theory into practice. So welcome along. My name's David Frame.
David, I think we want to welcome you first. And I would like to welcome everybody to the Hebe Haven Yacht Club. And we want to particularly welcome David Frame, who is actually really famous. Here is a picture in his book where he was actually training the mark layers at the Olympics in 2012. So he's a very famous mark layer, and he has got a lot of experience, and he's come speaking all the way from Scotland, over here, Bob. And we have some of our top Hong Kong mark layers as well. We've got Jason, Dave, and Barry, who are also competent race officers, and many of you are great sailors. And this is the first of 3 webinars that we're going to have on mark laying, because we cannot race if we don't have good mark layers. So our racing depends on people giving their time and effort and knowledge into putting the marks in the water in the correct place. So these 3 gentlemen are going to be moderators here. You can ask questions. I'm going to sit to one side, and over to you, David.
Okay, thanks Leslie for the introduction. I'm not sure famous or infamous if you speak to some of my colleagues, but yeah, as you say, we got involved with the Olympic Games, and in the build up to the Games way back in 2012, what we found, certainly in the UK, was that there was some really good race officers that were being made to look really bad because the mark layers, we couldn't get courses down, the boys weren't in the right position, they were dragging their anchors, and people didn't really know what they were doing running around in ribs. Of course, there was some really good mark layers that complained about that and said it was the opposite was true. There was some really bad race officers, and the mark layers were making them look good. But either way, we kind of looked at it and thought, well, race officers have been trained for years, but we've never really done any training for mark layers. So I got invited to sort of pull that together and look at how we could just up the level of race management across the board, actually. And it seemed to kind of raise the game a wee bit in the UK, and I now kind of share some of that knowledge. So the hope is it'll raise the game there for the club. You guys will hopefully enjoy what's going to come, and there's some practical stuff, but of course the real fun is out in the water, and I think it's just that, you know, that's difficult to do it with the COVID stuff that's going on just now. So a couple of sort of housekeeping things. I think if you're joining us online, I think Queenie's got you muted. We have got some breaks as we go through for questions, so you'll see the slides coming up, offering the opportunity to ask any questions. I think technically I might struggle to hear that from those in the club room because the microphone's on the computer, but we'll do our best to answer the questions as we're going through this. Okay, let's make a little start then. We've got a presentation here to run through, which will take about an hour. And as I say, there's pauses and breaks for questions as we get into it. Okay, if you've just bought a GPS and you're thinking you want to get into it, so you're getting it out of the box, there's a couple of things just to be aware of in setting it up. The first thing is when you put the batteries in it, and we are talking more about handheld GPSs rather than integrated sharp GPSs that are built into yachts and things like that, running off bigger batteries. So we're talking about AA's in the battery sizes. But when you get out of the box, it'll be a little bit slow to start with because it needs to initialize, it needs to find where it is on the planet. Whether that's Scotland or Hong Kong, and that can maybe take it sort of 15 minutes. So don't be disappointed if it doesn't jump up in the first 2 minutes and tell you precisely where you are. They do take a wee bit of time to just lock on and locate themselves on the planet. The other thing to do is there's a datum, and there's different datums around the world, but pretty much now the standard one, and I'm confident this will be the same in Hong Kong, is this WGS 84. And that's the latest one. That will mean that your GPS positions will line up with all the modern charts as well if you were ever to plot a position, but we're not really likely to do that. But the point is if somebody in one rib is on a different datum, then they're always going to be saying that your mark looks to be out of position because you're working off two different datums. So if everyone uses this WGS84, it's going to make everything fall into place and line up a wee bit better. The other bit really is just selecting units. So you need to go into the menu. Do you want kilometers an hour, meters per second, nautical miles per hour, or whatever? So really just selecting the units. We're going to be operating in the water, so we are looking to try and get nautical miles and meters. You might find that feet's an option. So just selecting the units we want to work in. So when we're talking to each other about distances, we're all in the same thing. We're not mixing up land miles with nautical miles. They're quite different. They're not the same length. So if we all use the same units, that'll make things easier as well. The language, I'll leave that up to you. The default setting one is possibly English. But if you change the language, just make sure you change it to one that you can speak. Otherwise, you won't understand the instructions to change it back to one that you do understand. So be a wee bit careful with the language settings. The other bit you can set up is really just that the bearings are magnetic bearings rather than true bearings. So you can select that in the menu. And that does mean if you're using a hand bearing compass, then what the compass tells you is what the GPS will be saying. So things are going to, again, all align a little bit better if you're working off magnetic rather than true. The GPS will know what the variation is. It will adjust a true bearing into a magnetic one because it knows where you are on the planet, and therefore it knows what the local variation is going to be. So you just need to select magnetic. You don't need to tell it the variation or anything like that. So that's it. You get it out the box, you get it set up, you follow that all through, and now we're ready to hopefully start using it. Just on that, I guess, just be aware if you turn it off, jump in a plane and flew over to Scotland and turned it back on again, you might find it has to reinitialize because it was turned off over a large distance. So if you're moving from country to country with it in your bag and then returning it on, it might need to take a wee bit longer just to reinitialize, just a wee bit from experience there. Okay, the other wee bits we want to do is really just customizing the display screen. GPSs give you a lot of information these days. It'll tell you what speed you're doing. It'll give you your own position and all of that. And we don't really need all of that as race officials, as mark layers. So there's a bit of getting stuck into the menu, getting familiar with your unit and trying to customize the display a little bit. Often the pages is sometimes a button on some of the particular handsets, the Garmin's, and there's different ways of just displaying the same information, so scrolling through the pages. But the bits there in green, so all we really need as mark layers is really a bearing to a waypoint and a distance to a waypoint. Bizarrely, we don't need to know where we are, and we don't need to know how fast we're going, and we don't need to know what altitude that we're at. So all of that information, if that can all be taken off the screen, that's going to make things a little bit easier. I think I have to be honest and say that's just going to involve you getting if you've got your own hand unit, is just getting it and having a play around in the menus to work out how to do that. The principle's the same. Individual sets and units will have their own menus and different routes to achieve that. So there's have a play with them and just see what you can come up with. So what we're looking for to have on our screens is the key information is a bearing to a waypoint and a distance to a waypoint. In terms of race management, if you've currently used GPS for navigation, either in your yachts or your power boats and things like that, what you tend to do is you navigate to a waypoint. You put a waypoint in and then it will tell you how far you've got to go and in what direction it is. And as when you drive towards it, you'll see the distance counting down. And then when you arrive, quite often it will come up on the screen and say arrived at waypoint. If you use several waypoints, then you arrive at one waypoint and then you go to the next one. That's what we call a route. It's really a breadcrumb trail, and you follow that in your navigation, and you can use it again and again. We don't do that in race management. We very seldom would go to a waypoint. Okay, so that's a sort of fundamental difference between kind of navigating and actually what we're going to be doing with our GPSs. So what we do as race management people is we've got to put these race marks out there on the water. So we put in one waypoint and then we drive around the waypoint to find predetermined bearings and distances for the race mark position. So we don't actually go to that waypoint. We drive around it and we look at our screen and it will tell us what the bearing to the waypoint is and the distance the waypoint is. And that means that we need some bearing and distance tables to help us position where these race marks are going to go out there on the water. Or it might be that the race officer gives us a bearing and distance, you know, so for example, on the start line, the race officer, when he's got his committee boat anchored, they might say, can you go 100 metres? And he'll give you a direction, whether it's a compass bearing, or he might just say 90 degrees to the wind, 100 metres away from me, and set the pin end of the start line. So it could be information from the race officer that we then use the GPS to measure the distance, and we can measure the angle back to the race officer on this committee boat, and there's some tables there to help us as well. And we'll come on and have a look at these in a minute or two. There's two widely used ways to save waypoints. There are other ways of doing it that are a little more complicated, but quite frankly are of little use to mark layers. And the two main ways that we're trying to get you up to speed with doing is that you input a given latitude and longitude as a waypoint. So somebody gives you a position and you effectively type that into your GPS because you're not at that position, you're somewhere else out on the water. And you type that into your GPS and then you can save it that way. Or the other way to do it is you can actually save your current position in the rib with your handheld GPS. You know, so for example, if you go up alongside the committee boat, there's a mark button in the GPS. If you've used it for yacht sailing or things like that, it's sometimes called a man overboard function. It's the same thing. So you can very quickly mark exactly where you are. If somebody falls in, you push and hold that button and then it automatically saves that position. And then it starts giving you the distance and the direction to get back to that position. So in a man overboard situation, that's quite useful because your GPS is telling you you've still got 50 meters in what direction they're in. So we can use that function. We can go up alongside the committee boat and effectively treat it as a man overboard. We can mark the position of the committee boat and then we can always measure the bearing and distance back to it. So if the race officer is telling us the length of the line, we just drive away from them until we watch the distance count up to the required 100 meters or whatever they've asked for. So that's the two main ways that we're going to be saving waypoints, and we'll have a wee look at them, and those that are going to be doing the practical exercise will be having a wee practice at that after this session. So marking the position, if you put any race marks in the water, I think if we got up on the screen on the whiteboard at the front of the room in the club there's a picture of a trapezoid course. So if, for example, you're laying mark 1, the windward mark, or mark 2 up at the top end of the course, if you put a mark in the water, then what we recommend is that you just save its position. So you go alongside it once it's anchored and you just push that mark function on the GPS just to save its position. The committee boat as well can be quite useful to mark, particularly as we've alluded to if you're setting the start line. So the race officer is going to give you a bearing and distance away from there for the other end of the start line. So if you mark the committee boat, you can then measure that bearing and distance to set the start line. And the term reference point comes in there, and we'll explain a wee bit more about that in a minute, but that you could mark a reference point as well, which we'll come on to and explain. Well, what we kind of recommend is that if you put any buoy in the water and mark it, is you then try and give it a name, okay? Because what GPS will do is the very first waypoint that you save or mark the position, it will be called 001. And that will keep going until you get to 999. So that the default setting is to give everything a number. So if you're running an event for 2 or 3 days and moving marks around, you might end up with 57 waypoints in there. And then when you're trying to measure the bearing and the distance back to it, you're not quite sure which one it should be. So giving things names a little bit will help. It'll also mean if you go back to that position, if you go back to the committee boat or the buoy that you've put in the water, and the distance isn't reading 0, then it's quite possible it's maybe dragged its anchor and moved. So it'll let you see if things are moving as well. If you mark the position and then you revisit it in an hour's time, is it still in the same place? The other thing that you can do is if we need to change the courses, so if we need to lengthen the course or shorten a course by moving marks 1 and 2 further upwind or dropping them back down towards the committee boat, then if we've marked the position of the buoy and the race officer says, can we increase the distance by 0.1 of a mile, then if we know where it was, we just need to increase it by 0.1 of a mile. So marking and naming the positions is quite good. Saving these positions and what these waypoints, whether it's latitude and longitude or marking the position, is half the battle. That will then store that position very accurately in your GPS. The other function you then need to do is to go into the menu and say, and tell the GPS you actually want to go to that position. So saving it is one thing, and then it will just disappear off the screen. It'll be sitting in a menu, a big long list of them all saved in the background. What you then need to tell the GPS is you actually want to go to it. And then that is when it can start telling you the bearing and the distance to it. So that was marking the position, going alongside something and just pushing, saving that position. The other one is to input a latitude and longitude. And what we've found with this is that humans cause the most errors. So if you think of the numbers here, so 0, 0, 10 degrees, 55 minutes, decimal 321, north, and then there'll be a longitude as well. So there's about 15 or 16 numbers in there. And if you put in a wrong number, then you're going to be in the wrong position, if that makes sense. So if over the VHF radio, somebody is transmitting a latitude and longitude that they want you to put into your GPS, what we recommend you do is actually just write it down. Don't try and put it in while they're transmitting. So a paper and pencil, write it down and read it back to them to make sure you've got it right before you spend time putting in the wrong numbers. So it's quite important that we put the right numbers into the GPS, otherwise we're going to be going to a different position. If, for example, you put 4 degrees instead of 5 degrees, you're 60 miles away from where you need to be, and each minute, if you're a minute out, you're 1 mile away as well. So the scale of a race course is always usually less than a mile, so there's some big errors there just by getting one number wrong. So we need to be quite careful, and it is probably, the GPS will be accurate. It will tell us to go exactly where we've put what we've put into it. So it will be good at it, and it's likely we're the ones that will make the mistake and not the GPS. One of the ways we've found to input a latitude and longitude is because there's 15 numbers there that need typed in, is a quick way to do it is actually just to mark your current position, wherever that is. And then what you can do is edit the latitude and longitude figures, because you're not going to be 60 miles away. So the first degree, or the whole degree number, is likely to be correct. You might even find that if you're pretty close to the latitude and longitude, you might not even have to adjust the minutes. It's just the decimal figures. So you effectively save where you are, knowing it's the wrong position, but then edit that in the menu. And that's quicker than trying to put in 15 or 16 different numbers, if that makes sense. So that's the 2 ways of putting information, these waypoints, into the GPS. As I said, we recommend you name the waypoints and keeping the name simple. So if you're putting in a reference point, latitude and longitude, just call it ref. If you're putting in a Mark 1 buoy, if that's the race mark you're laying, then maybe just call it M1 and things like that. Something that's going to work for you, so you can work your way around, because when you then want to go to a waypoint, and the list of waypoint comes up, if you can see it's M1, M2, M3, then you know what marks it is it's talking about. If it's just called 7, 8, and 9, because it's allocated a sequential number, then you're not necessarily going to know what they are. So naming them is quite important. What you'll find is when you go to save a waypoint, is just before you save it, you do have the option to edit it, and that's the time to actually, I'll ask you to confirm that you want to save it, so don't confirm it just yet. Have a wee play in the menu. You can scroll up and you'll see it be allocated a number, and at that stage you just change that number to a name like Mark 1. There's a bit of practice with the GPS just to get good at that, but strongly recommend you try and give something a name as we go to it. Folks, there's a wee pause here. Has anybody got any questions so far on that? I guess that I can either try and answer or that Barry or Dave or Jason in the club could maybe help with. I guess you might have to put your hand and Queenie can unmute you.
I think if you want to have a question, you have to come to the computer here and ask the question.
We'll just relay it to.
Yes. So, does anybody have any questions? Or wants some explanation? Just remember that you have this on the table if you want to have a look at it.
Okay, I'm not seeing any questions. That means either this has been really well explained so far or folk are too frightened to ask. Okay, I think we'll move on then. So when it comes to setting up a race course, then what we use as mark layers is there's two methods of doing this. There's what we call sometimes on-grid and off-grid. And on-grid means we're going to be using a reference system, and we'll look at that in a wee bit more detail, but really the position of marks on the race course is relative to a fixed reference point. So all the other marks are a bearing and distance away from the reference point, and that reference point is usually the mark 4 on a race course. And I think, or I'm hoping, that for those in the clubhouse, that there's a picture of a trapezoid course up on the whiteboard with mark 4 written at it. So that position just ahead of the start line, where mark 4 is becomes the reference point, and all the other marks, mark 1, mark 2, and mark 3 anyway, are all a bearing and distance away from that. So that's what we call the reference system. The other technique that we need to be able to use is what we call a daisy chain, or sometimes we talk about it being off-grid. The grid will become a wee bit apparent in a minute or two. So the daisy chain technique really means that the position of the mark is related only to the previous mark. So for example, the start line is, the other end of the start line is set by daisy chaining. Its position is relative to the committee boat. So if we know where the committee boat is, then we can set the pin end of the start line. Okay, it's not dependent on where mark 4 is, the reference point. And similarly, the finish position on a race course. So on a trapezoid course at mark 3, at the leeward end of the outer loop, hoping you can see that on the board, that finish position is daisy chained from mark 3. So once mark 3 is in position, the finish boat can then find its position. It is not based on a reference point. So we need to be able to use sort of both of these techniques, really depending which mark we're going to be setting. Both of them involve using your GPS to get bearings and distance. Okay. Quite often what we do is we set up on grid and then we end up working off grid with that in terms of these techniques. So here is, and I think this is hopefully similar to what we're looking at on the whiteboard in the clubhouse. There's just to get familiar with the trapezoid course. So we have the start line on the right. We have between 4 and 1, it was what we would call the inner loop, and quite often it's effectively just a windward leeward course, and sailors are going to race up and down there after starting. And then between 2 and 3 on the left-hand side is what we would call an outer loop, and there could be a separate race going on there with sailors beating and running up and down on the outer loop. So it's 2 windward leeward courses that only needs 1 start line and 1 finish line, so it allows 2 races to happen at the same time effectively. And that's what we're basing this on. And the premise is if we can set this course up on our GPS, then every other course is going to be much easier, because this is about as complicated as it gets in terms of course configuration, these trapezoid courses. So we can see what's happening. You can see the start line, and then 3 to the finish line is over on the left-hand side. So the inner loop is what we would call 1 to 4, and the outer loop is between 2 and 3. So effectively 2 separate racetracks sharing the same start and the same finish. There's 2 simultaneous races going on. Okay, so the reference point system. So the main course marks are based around a waypoint, which is really the mark 4 position. Okay, so if we know the latitude and longitude of mark 4, and we happen to be the rib that's laying mark 2, then we know that there's a bearing and a distance back to that Mark 4. Or similarly, if we're laying Mark 3, then there's a bearing and distance back to Mark 4. Same with Mark 1, there's a bearing and distance back to Mark 4. So if we know the position of Mark 4, we're driving away from it. We probably won't even go to it. We'll never go there if we're at the windward end of the course, but we need to get our GPS bearing and distance to line up so that it's going to be reading correct. Yep, that's really the reference point is all based onto that. So that is, we set up on grid. So here's what we mean by on grid. Okay, this is the grid of numbers, and I think there in the clubhouse, you guys have hopefully got copies of this scattered around the tables, just to help me explain this, and so you can see it in front of you as well. And it's really just like a big sort of Excel spreadsheet with rows and columns. If we look at the rows across the top, first of all, you see it's got course axis 4 to 1. And again, if that helps you to look at the picture on the whiteboard in the club, so that's the inner loop, so that's going 4 to 1 is from the bottom to the top. And then it's also got 3 to 2, so that's on the outer loop, and that's from the bottom to top. But then it gives you the reciprocal bearings, it gives you 1 to 4. So if you're looking at Mark 1, so that column there. So we can orientate ourselves around. It also gives you the bearings from 4 to 2, the bearing from 2 to 4. So again, a reciprocal, what the bearing should be from 4 to 3 or 3 to 4. And it also tells you that the start line things there. The sheet's split into 2 halves. So if we look at the course axis column, the black numbers in bold, so really every 5 degrees of the compass, so from 0 from north all the way around to sort of 360 degrees, you'll see, so it goes 0, 0, 0, 0, 5, 0, 10, 0, 15. So that number goes all the way down to 175. And then it just continues down by looking at the other half of the sheet. At the top there is 180, and it goes all the way down to 355. So what we're looking to do is, let's just call this the wind just now for simplicity. So if, for example, the wind is from the east, so from 90 degrees, then the highlight there on the screen will show you if you follow across. So if you were setting Mark 1, so Mark 1, the bearing down to Mark 4 to the reference point should be 270 degrees. Yeah. If you were setting Mark 2, then the bearing from Mark 2 to the reference point, to that Mark 4, should be 231 degrees. So that's what you're looking. So when you put your latitude and longitude into your GPS for the reference point, and then you push go to reference point, then what you're looking to drive your rib until that, if you're doing Mark 2, it's reading 231 degrees. So you're the right angle away from it, if that makes sense. You'll also see the other numbers there. So, yep, go on.
We just pause just to see if everyone's following what he's talking about. Would you like a very brief tutorial? Okay. Okay, David, do you just mind if I give the audience a brief tutorial on the whiteboard here to follow exactly what you're talking about? So it'll just make it easier for them to tune in.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that'd be great.
Okay. Let's take a step. So you're looking at let's start at the very top at this number here, 000, precisely due north. What we're doing is we're setting up a trapezoid course. Does everyone know what a trapezoid course does? It's effectively a rectangle, and we've skewed one edge. And so it's got the same length on both sides and both angles. And all we've done is just rotated a rectangle to give it, in this particular case, a 70-degree offset. That's what we're aiming for. And so if you follow his numbers here, if we had the committee boat at this particular point here, and the wind was coming directly due north, we'd be reading 0, 0, 0 due north. Okay? If you went from the committee boat up to Mark 1A, and let's call the course 1 nautical mile long, you would go from committee boat, just follow a course. If you had all this set up in your GPS, you'd follow a course 000 until you were 1 nautical mile away from the committee boat, right? Your reciprocal back to the committee boat would be 180 degrees. If you were looking at them with a hand compass, your reciprocal. What you are then doing is going from Mark 1 to Mark 2. This number here, Mark 1 to Mark 2, would be 250. How do we get to 250? 000 plus 70-degree offset. Or let's do it the other way. 360 degrees minus 70, 250. Okay? That is the reciprocal of a 70-degree offset. Oh, sorry. What we normally do is we would go 360 plus 70 minus 180 gives you 250. I was trying to avoid that step 2, so it doesn't. There's a slight process involved there. So then you're looking back, right? If you were at Mark 2 and you're looking at Mark 1, that angle would be 70 degrees through your hand compass. If you were at Mark 1, looking back to Mark 2, this direction, because you've just laid this mark here in your boat, right? And you're viewing back in this direction, you'd be looking, and this mark was set, it would be sitting on 250 degrees. That's how these tables work. So you're looking from Mark 2 to Mark 1, your angle would be 70 degrees. From Mark 1 to Mark 2, the reciprocal of that, 250 degrees. And you follow that all the way around. Does that make sense? Yeah. Sorry, David.
Yep, no, that's good. I mean, they are a bit challenging to get your head round because what you're facing is a sheet full of numbers. I mean, very often, if you're just late, I mean, it depends how you're going to do your mark laying. If you're doing 1 mark each, for example, somebody's going to do 1, somebody does 2, and somebody does 3. If you've got the luxury of 3 ribs, then you're only looking for 1 number off that whole page of numbers, which is the bearing of your mark back to the reference point. So whether it's 1 to 4, 2 to 4, or 3 to 4, you know, that's really all you're looking for. So you just need 1 of these numbers off that sheet. So there's a bit of a mind meld just looking at the whole sheet going, oh my goodness.
2 back to 4, right? So if you happen to be marked 2 then, and this is how you don't even need a GPS, and you don't even need it, all you need is a hand compass. I would know that through trigonometry, that using these tables, 2 back to 1, 70 degrees. 2 back to the reference point number 4 is 141 degrees. And so what I would do is I look for my mark number 1, and then I would, and if I keep that on 070, and I would then look back at the reference point until I'm at 141. And that intersection is precisely that point there. And so afterwards, after you drop the mark, you know that whether the mark is moved or not, because those 2 points never change. 070, 141. This is my, just like you do when you do a triangular reference on a navigation chart. Those 2, that intersection point there is where the mark lives. It will be precisely whatever course distance that happens to be on this particular chart. Always works out to be the same. It's just trigonometry like you would do in high school that we've all forgotten. It's written for you, yes.
Well, yeah, you don't have to do trigonometry because I can't do trigonometry.
Yes.
What it means is only number, the mark 1 need a GPS. The rest of them can use the compass, is that right?
Yes, exactly. So that's a very good point. So all you really need to do is have all you really need to do is have a bearing and distance to waypoint, exactly like David said before. Once you find your mark number 1, this is the way we normally do it, you then do the daisy chain and you know exactly where you are. Now this one here, and the reason I said it's a trapezoid is a skewed rectangle. All the sides are the same length. This distance here, sorry, the bearing from 3 to 2 is also 0, 0, 0, due north. They're both pointing due north. The distance will be exactly the same as well. If that is 1 nautical mile long, this will also be 1 nautical mile long. So when you look at 3 back to 4, 3 to 4 is 0, 7, 0. 2 to 1, 0, 7, 0. So if I drew another line here, and you had a, what do you call it, a thing to read angles, it would, a protractor, that would both be 0, 7, 0. And the angles, if there was another, if you kept on drawing that line down here, you would have, all the angles would be exactly the same because it's just a skewed rectangle. Does that make sense? Does that kind of demonstrate how all this kind of fits into place on that? Sorry, David.
Yep, no, that's fine. And I mean, the next couple of slides might just help a wee bit more on that. Barry. Okay. And I guess, I mean, I'm guessing because I can't see the whiteboard, but I know that I think we've drawn the north as being the top of the board. Would that be correct?
Right.
Yeah. You know, so actually north is a good example to get your head around it, but then you need to ask yourselves, how often is the wind from 0, 0, 0? You know, it's always coming from the side or an angle, and that's where there's a bit of mental agility, just getting your head around what way we're actually facing with some of this. I mean, another example is if the course axis was 215, and we've highlighted up there on the screen, then certainly for the main course marks, so we've got the position of 4, that's our reference point, so we're looking at marks 1, 2, and 3, then we can see the bearings there. So 1 to 4 would be 35 degrees, you know, 2 to 4 would be 356 degrees in that example, and 3 to 4 would be 285 degrees. So it's just reading off. What I do is, if I'm doing mark 3, is all I need is that 285 degrees. I will just write that down on a wee bit of paper. So, and then I've got it, and then I'm not losing the you know, reading from the wrong line, grabbing the sheet out the bottom of the rib and trying to find out what the number should be again. So once you know what the axis is and which mark you're doing, you could just write down the one number you need out of this, 285 degrees if I'm doing mark 3, you know, or if I'm doing mark 2, it's going to be 356 degrees there. So you just write down your one number. And that's the frustration of the sheets. I've never counted them up, but it looks like a million numbers on there. You need one. Yep. So at any one time. So so that's a little bit about the numbers. We just bear that one in mind. So that 215 bearing, if we're 1 to 4 would be 035. That's one side of the sheet. The other side of the sheet then talks about, because that's the bearing to waypoint that we were talking about, that really needing. So the other one is the distance to waypoint. So on the back here, we have a distance table, and really it's talking about the length of the beats from 4 up to 1. As Barry said, with the same length as 2 to 3, it's just skewed slightly. So if we're looking, if the race officer decides that he wants 0.8 of a mile, then we can work out that the distance across the top, on the highlight there in the middle, would be 0.53. Okay, so depending on what distance the race officer wants for the length of the beats to be, we look down the table and then we can see that. If I was laying mark 3, for example, then I could see that the distance to the reference point, so back to point 4, would be 0.53. So I've got my bearing to waypoint, but I've also got my distance to waypoint now to fix that position on my GPS screen. The race officer chooses the leg length. That'll depend on the class of boats. Are they fast or slow? Faster boats are going to need longer leg lengths, so get there quicker. If the wind's light, then you might want a shorter leg length because it's going to take them longer. So it's really a judgment call on the race officer to choose a leg length depending on the class and depending on the conditions at the time. But a fairly standard one would be around that 0.7, 0.8 of a mile to give a good beat, sort of thing. So once you know that, you can then get your bearing and your distances back to the reference point. I think we have a wee kind of worked example. So let's say, for example, that we looked at this on the sheets. You could look at this on your sheets. So if, let's say, we agree that the axis, the wind direction, is going to be 215 degrees, and the race officer wants a length of that 0.8 nautical miles for the first beat. So you come along in your rib. You could mark the position, in this case, if you wanted, of the committee boat, because he knows how far away, and then you mark that position, and then you're going to drive your rib, looking at your GPS screen until you get upwind. And we know that the bearing to the waypoint is, so the wind's from 215 degrees. You can read off the sheet, the reciprocal of that will be 35 degrees. So as we drive away, we're trying to keep the angle at 35. And he's asked for 0.8 of a mile. So you can see on the GPS, that's a Photoshop thing of a GPS screen. So you can see we've driven away the required distance. So when I get the two numbers to line up, then I know I'm in the right position to put the buoy in the water. I've gone the right distance, 0.8, and I've gone the right, I'm in the right bearing. It's a reciprocal bearing of the wind direction, in this case 035, and the sheet will help you get that number as well, if that makes sense. Phew. Okay, just in terms of getting the reference point, how do we know where it is? If the whole course and all of these tables, that grid is all based around the reference point, how do we actually get it? It's most common for whoever's going to be laying Mark 4 to just get the reference point. That the race officer themselves, they don't really go there. They've anchored their committee boat. They're not at where that Mark 4 is. So they anchor the committee boat. And then typically what you're looking to do, if you're the person that's going to be laying Mark 4, is go halfway along the start line and about 100 meters or so upwind. And if the race officer wants that further or less, then he'll let you know. So the rib driver, you drive halfway along the start line and then you drive about 100 meters upwind. And then you can just save that position, and that latitude and longitude is what the rest of the mark layers need to orientate the course around that trapezoid course around that position. Okay, so the person, that the rib that has got the reference point here by doing that is probably then going to have to get on his radio and transmit the latitude and longitude. So they themselves have saved that position by marking it on their GPS by holding the mark button down. But the others who aren't going to come here, they're outside doing some wind readings, they're upwind, they may be doing other things. So they're going to get that position transmitted to them, typically over the VHF radio. So that's how we get the reference point. Because of that, you then need to just think about the radio procedures as to how you communicate the reference point. If you just start reading it out in the radio, you're going to read out 16 digits. It's a latitude and longitude. Then it's unlikely people are going to be ready to take that down. So we've sort of developed some techniques of sort of standby warning to receive the reference point. And then we had the Mark 1 rib would come back as first saying Mark 1 ready, then Mark 2 would come on and say Mark 2 ready, and Mark 3 would come on and say Mark 3 ready. So we're making sure everybody's now, what we mean by ready is of a time to get the papers and pencils out, and they're now ready for the position to be transmitted. And once everybody confirms they're ready to write it down, then the boat down at Mark 4 that's got the reference point would then transmit the latitude and longitude of the reference point around the team. Okay, so it's worth getting that bit right. The trouble with a reference point system, if somebody's working off a different reference point because they've got a wrong number, then the course configuration is not going to be what you've drawn in the whiteboard. It's going to be something different. Okay, so it's critical that we're all working off the same reference point. Okay, as I said earlier, if you're a degree out, you're 60 miles away. It's also critical we all work off the same table. So that table that you've got in front of you is a 70-degree table. You just need to be aware there's 60-degree tables as well. And this has got to do with boat with spinnakers like a tighter reach, boats with like lasers like a slightly broader reach because they don't have spinnakers. So the top reaching angle from 1 across to 2 is just a little bit tighter on one course than the other. So there's 2 sets of tables. So just make sure that the whole mark laying team are working off the right set and the same set of tables with that. It's also critical that we all work off the same axis. So if you're picking up the wind direction as being from the north and somebody else has got it from 10 degrees, then they're reading a different line from you on that grid. And obviously then the course itself is going to become skewed. So we need to make sure we're all on the same axis, we're all working off the same wind direction. And it might be that's not the wind where you are, yours is just a little bit different. So we try and take an average wind reading over the whole course. So don't worry if it's 5 degrees, not quite what you're getting, because it might be as an average over the race course. So we all need to be in the same axis, we all need to be on the right 70-degree tables. And we all need to be in the same reference point if this is going to work. So there's a few areas there where this could go wrong, so please be aware. Okay, a lot there, folks, to take in, and thanks for Barry kind of stepping in with that. Is there any, we pause if there are any questions for those in the room?
We have one question, David.
Yeah.
I'm sometimes a race officer, and very often in Hong Kong, the last thing I do is set the start line. So if the start line's not set, and you said you wanted to set the reference point from midway along the start line and up to the number 4 mark, I mean, how do you do that if there's no start line?
Yeah, I mean, if the start line's not in, hopefully we've got a pretty good idea of where the wind's coming from. So we can do a rough estimate as to where it's going to be. I mean, if in doubt, you could go 120, 130 meters upwind. So that there is a way of doing that. I think maybe the tables as well, that there's a signal, there's a bearing from the committee boat to the reference point as well, but that can be a little bit trickier to do for practical reasons. So yeah, I get what you're saying. If the start line's not in, how do you get the reference point? It's probably going to be a kind of best estimate, because the whole course is kind of pivoting around the reference point, really. So there should be room to do that. If in doubt, put Mark 4 further upwind. So if the start line's not quite where we thought, then it's still going to be clear. As long as it's below the gate, it won't really matter, below that Mark 4 position.
I'm Leslie Anderson, and sometimes.
Sorry, Leslie, you need to talk into the computer mic, otherwise I can't hear you.
Because we're actually a lot of the time talking about club racing, we're using the committee boat as the reference point, which actually isn't very good sometimes, because our windward mark is in line with the committee boat, and it's not just slightly over from the middle of the line where it should be. Are you in the habit of giving out a GPS position for your supposed reference point in this situation? A sort of guesstimate of what your GPS position would be of the reference point?
Yeah, it would be quite hard to estimate, these 16 digits that are going to make up the latitude and longitude. You can certainly get the first numbers right, but the decimals would just be a guess. It is easier if you can just go there and mark the position that you think is going to fit. If you don't want that, if you just want to use the committee boat, because if you're going 0.8 of a mile upwind, and if Mark 1 is 50 meters to the left or right, over that 0.8 of a mile, that's a very small percentage error. So lots of clubs who aren't using gates as leeward marks and that are still just using the committee boat as a reference point, and they want the windward mark 0.8 of a mile up from the race officer. So you could just, the reference point, if you wanted to make it the committee boat, would still work. They could go alongside the committee boat and just mark it.
Hi, sorry, it's Jason. Can I give a practical example of exactly those 2 points that we had in the last race? So Barry was the race officer. It was the last Typhoon Series geometric course, and the start line had not been set, but we knew we needed to get the race underway. So I came down, I didn't ping where the start boat was. I guesstimated how long the start line was going to be, roughly 80 meters, 100 meters or so. Went out perpendicular to the wind, 90 degrees to the wind, out from the committee boat about 40 meters. Hit mark, which is the MOB, and then just went straight up on the wind axis for 1.4 nautical miles. And that's where the top mark is. So it is actually quite simple. It's quite a simple procedure to follow. If you ping the committee boat, which is what we used to do, it was only a few years ago that we started actually taking the reference point for windward leeward courses. You end up with a bit of a skewed course. The pin's right above the committee boat, and so if anyone starts at the pin end of the start line, they're actually quite disadvantaged. Right? So we do try to take the middle of the start line, wind axis, length of course that the RO will tell you that he wants, which in this particular case was 1.4 nautical miles. And we're putting in 2 pins. So we did one at 1.2, sorry, 2 top marks, 1.2 and 1.4. So you'd progressively just drop them off on the way up. So that's a practical example of those 2 questions.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. Yeah, any other questions? Good. Yeah, I mean, I think I would just add to that. I mean, actually, there is a bearing and distance for the committee boat, but what happens is typically the committee boat goes out and anchors, and the race officer becomes the centre of the universe, and everything seems to revolve around the committee boat. Whereas in theory, the reference point's there, the committee boat should also anchor on a bearing and distance from the committee boat, but because of the length of line when you're anchoring committee boats, it's very, very hard to do that. There is another GPS skill of projecting waypoints, but race officers, in my experience, don't know how to do that. So if they anchor their committee boat where they're happy, they can then, in theory, project the waypoint by bearing and distance to get the reference point. But the skill set for that is a little bit almost beyond some of the mark layers, and race officers kind of struggled with that concept. So it was always just became easier for a mark layer just to drive kind of halfway along where they thought the line was going to be and just push upwind a wee bit so that they'd be clear of the start line and mark a position as the reference point. That was easier than race officers trying to project them from the committee boat and then having to transmit them when actually they've got lots of other things going on in the committee boat at that time. Yeah, okay. We'll move on. So I think we're into sort of 2/3. Of course, not all the marks, 50% of the marks on the trapezoid course are not on the reference point. And we talked earlier about this daisy chaining or being off grid. So the tables that we've got, that grid of numbers is no good to us. So for example, the gate marks there. So most leeward courses now have a gate. It's not just one mark, there's a second mark that goes round. So it is a bearing and distance from the first mark. The pin end of the start line is a bearing and distance from the committee boat. The second mark at 3 that's circled there, that gate mark, it's a distance and across the wind bearing from the mark 3 that was found by the reference point. And the finish as well is a bearing and distance from the position of gate 3. So the reference point doesn't help putting these marks in, and that's where we need to be able to do this daisy chaining technique. Like that. So for example, to do the start line, you go alongside the committee boat, you mark where it is, and then you drive the right distance and bearing away from it that the race officer is going to tell you. So the daisy chaining, that off-grid is really where the position of the mark is related to a nearby mark or a nearby position, and that's really what these arrows are trying to sort of show there. So we need to be able to do that as well. Just come back to that one. So setting the gates, I mean, the gates are really, we'll talk a wee bit about the length then, but typically about 40 meters between the first mark. You know, if you look at mark 4, if you put that in on the reference point, then where does the other mark 4 go to make it a gate? It goes about 40 meters and it goes perpendicular, it goes at right angles to the course axis. So you can get the bearing off the sheet, you can work out what right angles to the course axis is, but it doesn't give you the distance off the sheet. So if you're looking to 40 meters, you go alongside the first mark, you mark it in your GPS, and you drive away on it in the right direction until your distance is counting up to 40 meters, and you drop the second mark in. So that's what we mean by that kind of daisy chaining. The finish boat as well, it goes a set distance and angle away from Mark 3, and I think that information is on the table. But the point is it's daisy chaining. It's from Mark 3. It's not from that reference point back at 4. So you need the finish position can't be set up until the Mark 3 buoy is in the water. Because there's nothing for them to measure their distance and bearing away from. So that the mark at 3 has to go in, and then they can measure their bearing and distance away from it to start setting the finish up. So we can see that this on-grid, working off the tables using the reference point, and then working off-grid to set start lines, finish lines, and gates are all going to be necessary. So the start line would be a daisy chain technique. Mark 4 would be a daisy chain that's from this going along the start line and 100 meters upwind. So once we know where that is, marks 1, 2, and 3, the main course marks, if you like, they're going to be done on the reference point. And then the additional, if we're having gates rather than just a single leeward mark, then they're going to be set up by daisy chaining off of the existing mark that's there. And the finish is set up by daisy chain. So we need to be able to understand and apply both these on and off grid techniques, this reference point technique, and also the daisy chain technique to set up the course. Okay, any questions on that? No, okay, looks good. Just conscious of time as well. So just moving on. With all of these using the GPS, and you can very much end up with your head down in the boat. Okay, so don't be afraid just to do a wee reality check, you know, maybe before you drop the anchor and the buoy in the water, because if it's not right, you're just going to have to pull it back up again. So just that wee pause before you chuck all the anchor in. So really just, if you've got a hand-bearing compass, just to check the GPS angles as was being described. So you've got your bearing on your GPS. If you're doing Mark 2, it will give you a bearing back to the reference point at Mark 4, but actually you could just check the bearing up to Mark 1 as well to 2-point fix the position. One bearing's on the GPS and the other one's by a handheld compass. And if you're in the right position, the numbers will all line up. If you're not in the right position and the GPS number's lining up, but the one on the compass isn't, then it's maybe the Mark 1's in the wrong place. You know, so, or it could be you. So you're then left with an element of doubt. It's not, doesn't do any harm just to check why is that not lining up if I think I'm in the right place. So use a hand-bearing compass just to check that what you're doing actually fits. Look at a birdie, you know, is the windward mark really upwind, or have you had your head down in the boat and shot off at some sort of funny angle? If you are upwind, are you looking downwind towards the gates or towards the committee boat? So you know, don't be afraid to get your head out the boat and have a look around you and just make sure everything is actually fitting with reality. You'll have appreciated from looking at the grid sheets, there's a wee bit of mental maths. So if the wind's from the north, what's the reciprocal? Well, that's an easy one. So if the wind's from the north, then the reciprocal's south, so that's 180 degrees. But actually, if the wind's from 255, what's the reciprocal? And you can see where that starts to hurt your brain a little bit more. You will get the answer off the sheet because you'll find the reciprocal answer on it. So do check if you're like me and you're not very good at maths, of do I add 180 or subtract 180? Might depend what number you're on. So you use the sheets just to confirm reciprocal bearings and things like that, and be aware of the
Do you mind if I show the audience this? We call it a whiz wheel. It's
you got one. Excellent.
Yeah, and oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, I know exactly what you mean. Yeah, no, that's what I use because I'm rubbish at mental math. So if you've got one, you can show.
Yeah, we all are. We're all, especially as you get older. And so one of the problems is, so if you took a bearing and the wind on that particular day happened to be 75 degrees, what's the reciprocal of 75 degrees? Quick answer. So all you do is you put up here 75 degrees up here, and you've got a reciprocal bearing there straight away. Now, as David was explaining before, when you're putting in your gates or a start line or a finish line, it's a 90-degree perpendicular to that. All right. And so then you need 75 degrees plus 90. Right, and then I just sit here and go 75 degrees plus 90. It's, you know, it works. It's you just flick it around the wheel, and it gives you every perpendicular and every reciprocal on the compass. And it's called a whiz wheel. The yacht club had these made up, and Brenda Davies was kind enough to actually make an extra one up for me. You can get these in stationery stores, a similar kind of thing. They're going to make a new and improved version next time, where instead of it just being a plain plastic, they're going to put it on like a scratch pad. Like these are for diving, for underwater. You can write on it with a pencil. And so you write down the coordinates that are given to you by the RO, and it won't rub off. It's waterproof, but you can just erase the pencil later on. And so they're going to make new and improved ones of these, and maybe Hebe can do this, because as you go into some of the bigger events and the you know, the dinghy regattas, and certainly if you go into something like the Oppie Worlds, these are invaluable, because, and then during the course of the race, you get a 15-degree wind shift. All of that mental gymnastics you were doing goes out the window, because you've now got to recalculate everything, and this just really speeds up the whole process.
Yeah, excellent. I would, if you can get your hands on one, if you can beg, borrow, steal, or make one, I would encourage you to do that. I've got one on a wooden board that if I drop it in the bottom of the rib and stand on it, it won't matter. It's pretty indestructible. Yeah, so thanks, that's great. So there's a bit of kind of combining the technology on the GPS with some of the traditional methods as well. That's the reality check. I think just be aware that the GPS distances, so, and you might find this, those that are going to go outside and have a wee play with this, so the greater the distance, the more reliable they are. So when we're measuring the length of, you know, the windward mark, you know, it's 0.8 of a mile or 1 mile upwind from the waypoint down at 4, that we're not going to notice any errors with that. When we start measuring at 40 meters between two gate marks, for example, so we're trying to put the second one in and drive 40 meters away, the percentage error is bigger, because we're working, you know, we're kind of micro working now rather than over a large scale. We're down to meters, and the accuracy of the GPS is within a few meters, which means if we're working in meters, it's going to be a few meters out a little bit, and there's not much we can do about that. So if we're trying to set, for example, a 40-meter gate, just be aware of that there'll be an increased error in the distance that the GPS is going to read back to the first mark of the gate. So use your eyes, you know, 8 boat lengths. So if you're driving a 5-meter rib, does it look about 8 boat lengths? Does it look right before you put the second mark in? You know, so again, it's just that reality check. Get your heads out the boat. Don't become too fixated on your GPS screen. You know, does it actually look right? And encourage you to do, particularly for things like the gates. Start lines aren't so bad, because you're now stretching out to maybe 80, 90, 100, 120 meters. So again, the error is now getting reduced and reduced because the distances are getting greater. But particularly with the gates, with that sort of 40, 35 meter lengths that the race officer might ask for, then just be aware that of the percentage error can creep in with that.
David, on the distances between marks, we also normally use a rangefinder, which is quite good. It is more accurate than what the GPS is, just because of the satellite signals. They are supplied sometimes, but quite often not. But if it is supplied within your mark box, it makes it much easier for the start line and all the gates to be set. So that's the box that needs to go in.
Excellent, luxury. So if you've got a rangefinder, that's the answer really to get away from that GPS error. I didn't mention them simply because they're quite expensive, and not a lot of people have them. They're actually designed for golfers to measure the distance between holes and the distance to the flag, so they know which club to choose. So they are sort of weatherproof. They're not specifically designed for mark layers, but they do work really well for setting gates. Yeah.
I think we shouldn't have 40. Yeah, we should have maybe 40 meters in our line for the gate, because
Yeah, so I can't hear that. If that was a question, Leslie, I'm not hearing it.
Leslie was just making the comment that for us not to be too fixated on 40 meters as being the gate width. It depends upon the fleet, obviously. You know, if you've got 15 oppies on the course, it's going to be very different to 5 TP52s. So your gate size will be much different. Yes.
Yeah. So really the gate size is there's some racing rules get involved with this. So there's a 3 boat length circle needs to be around each mark. And these 3 boat length circle, there should be a small gap between them. And this is so that the racing rules will come into play for the sailors going around the marks with overlaps and calling for water and things like that. So the width of a gate very much, so that 3 boat length circle then almost dictates the width of the gate. So it's going to be 6 boat lengths plus a gap in the middle, call it 2 boat lengths. It's going to be about 8 boat lengths, probably as a minimum, and maybe about 10 boat lengths as a maximum. So now you can see if we're talking an optimist, it's going to be very much different than if you're talking a 470. And then there's a discretionary element might come in if it's a really wet and windy, you know, if it's a ballistic windy day and the boats are running down, if they're 49ers, 4.9 meters, all carrying spinnakers, you might stretch it a wee bit further just for safety reasons as well, you know, because they do come in at speed. So the gate width is really agreed with the race officer on the day, so it's not every gate's 40 meters. That's a good point. Yeah. Okay, good. So just be aware, back to the GPS then, the more waypoints you save, it can become more confusing, because when you go to a waypoint, the whole list is going to come up. And we've already said that if you've got a clear naming system, that will help you choose the right one for the list. But also what we do is we recommend that that waypoints are cleared out and deleted at the start of the next day. So we don't say clear them out at the end of the day. And the reason for that is if there's any protests and arguments about the width of the gate and that cause some penalties or rule infringements, and you know there's evidence in your GPS that the gate was set at the right length or the right width, hopefully. So don't, if you've got these GPS positions in your unit because you've marked the position of the marks when you've put them in, then we've got evidence that actually the gate was sound. You know, it wasn't a race management issue. The sailors need to sort it out between themselves. So don't clear them out until the end of the day. Protests are generally held at the end of racing. They shouldn't be dragging on to the next day. So when you go out in the water the next day, I would just delete everything that you used the day before. The wind's going to be from a different direction. The committee boat's not going to anchor in exactly the same place. Your reference point, everything will just be slightly different. So start with a clean, empty file of logged waypoints, if you like, at the start of the day. Will help with that. Okay, folks, that's pretty much the end of the sort of webinar on the GPS. For those in the clubhouse, I'm going to hand over now to the club experts there, Barry and Dave and Jason, and they're going to take you outside and have a go at doing some of this, marking your current position, that kind of man overboard function. Can you give a name to the waypoint? They'll maybe give you a latitude and longitude, see if you can put that in as well, as though somebody had transmitted it over the radio to you, and then just having a moving around and seeing if we can start thinking about setting up with some cones. Could we set up a trapezoid course? It certainly marks 1, 2, and 3, and just see if we can do this out in the car park with that. So that's what's going to follow for those in the clubhouse. I guess that pretty much means that that's all from me, folks. If there's any other questions, because I'm going to sort of sign off at this point and leave you in the capable hands of the local experts. Is there anything else for me before?
I'm not sure there's a lot else for you to do. I want to thank you very much for giving us this webinar, and we're really looking forward to the next 2. I also want to make a special thank you to Elena. You see a person up here, Elena. She's actually running the Cyprus Sailing Federation, and she has joined our webinar tonight. So we're now becoming international. So thank you, Elena, for coming. Thank you, David, and thank you, Jason.
Thank you. I guess there's more later. I was just going to push, Leslie, that, you know, for mark layers, so we've now looked at the GPS side of things. So just as a wee hook in, for if you haven't already, so that there's 2 more webinars later on in November, both in a similar format, 7 till 8 on a Wednesday, the 18th of November there, and the 25th of November. So you know, if you want to sign up for these, they'll focus a little bit more on putting the marks in the water themselves, so dealing with some of the equipment side of things. And other equipment that mark layers use, and also some of the signalling stuff that we might be asked to do at an event. So if you haven't seen them already, worth signing up for. Good, thanks very much, folks. I hope those that are taking part in the next session, my advice is watch you don't get lost in your own car park. It has happened before. Good luck.
So thank you very much, and over to you, you 2, 3 guys.
Would you like to construct one on whiteboard so that you know what you're doing in the would that be beneficial? Sharon?
I think that's exactly what you